And welcome back. So, for this second half of the Week 3 lecture, we have 3 key issues. They're less definitions and more larger cultural patterns to pay attention to. The first is thinking about the relationship between subjects and objects. The second is thinking about how resistance gets incorporated or even co-opted. And the third is thinking about the body as a type of cultural text, right? Text in quotation marks, to refer to it in the way that we've been talking about it in terms of this class, as something so filled with cultural meanings to be unpacked and deciphered. So, on the first point of subjects versus objects, we begin with the definition of subjectivity that we introduced last time. Right? Subjectivity as the state of possessing a sense of self that is shaped by power relations. So, subjects are defined in opposition to objects. Subjects are those people and things that possess subjectivity, right? That state of consciousness. And that consciousness includes agency. So subjects are able to make complicated choices and have different types of motivations and passions. Subjects are defined in opposition to objects. Objects possess no consciousness. And whereas subjects have agency and therefore can act, objects are those which are acted upon. So if you pay attention to scholarly debates or media advocacy groups or even public discussions around TV representations, you can see that these issues of subjects and objects are always at stake. While subjects and objects are very much a philosophical issue, they're also a hotly political issue, because one does not have to take a college course to know that certain groups of people are oftentimes depicted as objects as opposed to subjects, right? Paying attention to the history of stereotypes that have characterized Asian American, Latina, and Latino representation, we can very much see that those stereotypes are more about making us into objects than subjects. So, you'll notice how the difference between the subject and the object oftentimes has a lot to do with our naturalization and internalization of whiteness. Whiteness shapes both of those. So, for example, if we pay attention to the token whatever character that has become a new television trend, we'd be thinking very difficultly about the relationship between subjects and objects. Is that token character an actual character who possesses a full storyline, or are they an object, more like a symbol or a thing as opposed to a person? We'd also be thinking about this in terms of the debates that have surrounded shows like Devious Maids and Glee, if you're paying attention. And how the terms of the debate oftentimes are in terms of whether they're three-dimensional characters or whether they repeat old stereotypes. And so you'll notice that the idea of being a three-dimensional character is very much about this issue of subjectivity. As opposed to repeating old stereotypes, that has a lot to do with those old depictions of objecthood. We can also see this divide between subjects and objects in 2 of the scholarly articles for the week. If we think about Jennifer Esposito's question as to whether or not Ugly Betty is a real person, and of course the answer is no, because she's a representation. She thinks about the extent to which Betty is actually resistance, right? Because on the one hand, Esposito is well aware that the reason why Ugly Betty as a television show was being seen as so progressive is because it involves Latinas and Latinos possessing subjectivity and agency, which even today is still something really new. However, she pays attention to those old ideologies that instead make her body into more of an object, as opposed to the subjectivity that the show claims to be giving her. We can also see this issue of subjects and objects in Hiram Perez's article on Tiger Woods, because he asks the question of the extent to which Tiger Woods' autobiography is actually his as a subject, or how much he's being made into an object, and how his story is becoming less of his, and he becomes more of a symbol and an icon than an actual person. So, subjects and objects, keeping this in mind, really complicates the terms of representation. It's not just that having an Asian American or Latina or Latino body automatically makes it resistance, because we need to pay attention to these issues of subjectivity, and also the changing nature of hegemony. And paying attention to these changes draws us back to our diagram of intersectionality, because we're thinking in more sophisticated ways about how, on the one hand, identity and difference shapes these issues of subjectivity and culture, but also how we need to be mindful of how we as subjects and our subjectivity is very much shaped by these external forces that we come to internalize as our own. So then we can think about resistance and changes in the nature of hegemony itself. And here we're looking at a connection between Hiram Perez's article and Cho Noriega's article. You'll recall this diagram of hegemony. In hegemony, there's a dominant group and a subordinate group. The dominant group rules through discipline and manufactures consent through ideology. However, the subordinate group can find a way to break consent by forging modes of counter-hegemonic resistance. But there's a way that this resistance, instead of replacing this model, can instead just be sucked back in as the new terms of ideology. You'll notice this in the way that Hiram Perez talks about all those issues that we used to consider resistance and the way that they've become themselves hegemonic images, such as diversity, multiculturalism, or even freedom struggles. So the connection to draw between Hiram Perez and Cho Noriega is the way that they talk about how civil rights struggles have been reincorporated into the new terms of hegemony, whereas the 1950s to 1970s civil rights struggles, specifically looking at African American and Chicano civil rights, have instead become the new terms of consent. Hiram Perez talks about this in terms of his discussion of the Tiger Woods commercial, where he says, "I am Tiger Woods," and those little kids, each more adorable than the last, also says, "I am Tiger Woods." He talks about how that image comes from a Spike Lee film, which itself was co-opting this iconic civil rights narrative. So in his discussion of Spike Lee, you'll notice that Perez talks about how even in that transition, what we see as resistance, right? Because Spike Lee's films are seen as being really political and inciting a lot of this discussion. Even in that original adaptation that then becomes really co-opted by the Tiger Woods commercial, these freedom struggles are instead being sucked back into hegemony as the new form of consent, right? They're not actually contesting anything anymore, but we're given the illusion that they are because they recall these older moments of resistance. We can also see this in Cho Noriega's article when he talks about the category of Chicano and the category of Latino as becoming beautiful identities, right? As becoming a type of artistic genre. And the way that that genre, while it does really important political work of recognizing that Chicanas and Chicanos and Latinos and Latinas can create art, is in this weird contradiction of, on the one hand, being recognized, but then also being unfairly put under market pressures because we live in a racist culture. So to think intersectionally about this, we can go back to our definition of nation, right? Nation and nationality appears to us as the formal and cultural process of belonging, but at its structural level refers to the regulation of lives according to bureaucratic power. If we think intersectionally about race and nation, we can understand these two civil rights struggles, the African American civil rights movement and the Chicano civil rights movement, as being about demanding representation within the nation, right? If we're thinking intersectionally about race and nation as categories of identity and difference. But at the structural level, through the co-optation of these freedom struggles, we can understand how inclusion, while it appears to us as a great thing because it allows African Americans and Chicanos to feel like we belong to the national story, we can see how this inclusion is also a way of subjecting us to power, right? Those changing terms of hegemony, by which what used to appear to us as resistance is actually just the new nature of consent. So, as we talk about these changing terms of hegemony, we can also talk about our racialized and gendered bodies as a cultural text. So here we're looking at a connection between Nancy Young's article and Jennifer Esposito's article. And to continue thinking intersectionally, I also want us to remember our definition of gender, which appears to us as the cultural classification based on bodies that goes beyond our bodies to also refer to appearances and practices and all sorts of things that we gender. And structurally relates to the distribution of labor and agency. I also want us to think intersectionally about race and sexuality. Sexuality, which appears to us as real and imagined acts of desire and pleasure, sex. But at its structural level, refers to forms of social organization and the way that we reproduce the normal. So, in Nancy Young's article, we can see bodies as a cultural text in terms of her discussion of crossover roles, right? Crossover roles being the acting traits term for those characters who really could be of any racial background, but because of our naturalization of whiteness, often appear to us as being portrayed by white actors and actresses. So she talks about how the crossover role is oftentimes denied to Asian American actors, and how Asian American actors are oftentimes forced into roles that reproduce old stereotypes, such as the dragon lady or the submissive Susie Wong, or the emasculated Asian male or the karate master, and how through this binary structure of stereotypes, Asians are always seen as not human, right? The human being, the universal crossover role. And you can see in Young's discussion about how gender and sexuality intersect with race, not just through these roles always being gender specific, but as always sort of designating Asian Americans as not belonging and being kind of inappropriate, right? Like when we think about depictions of Asian American women in romance roles, the over-sexualized Lucy Liu is oftentimes seen as kind of an inappropriate lover if you look at her older films. We can also see the body as a cultural text very clearly in Esposito's article, when she talks about how Betty's body is read in this sort of racial drama. She also unpacks how race intersects with gender ideologies and intersects with sexual ideologies, when she talks about the way that her body is depicted in relation to class and racial standards of beauty, as well as class definitions of professionalism that she, because of her race, is seen as being outside of. Esposito's textual analysis draws our attention to these ideologies that persist even within the somewhat resistant text of Ugly Betty. So,